There is a kind of loneliness that doesn't live in empty rooms. It lives in full ones. The kind where laughter echoes, plates clink, and family fills the house. Yet a quiet ache hums behind your ribs. Arvin felt that ache. He wasn't a man abandoned. His wife still set his tea down each morning. His children still called him Baba. His grandchildren still hugged him when they visited. But when he looked in the mirror, he saw someone who hadn't spoken his truth in decades, a stranger wearing his own face. He was surrounded by people, but had never felt more invisible. Carl Jung once wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." And that is where Arvin's pain began, not in isolation, but in suppression. For years, he was the rock of the family, steady, reliable, always calm. But what no one saw was the erosion happening underneath, because the moment you stop expressing what matters to you, you begin disappearing, not from others' lives, but from your own. It didn't happen all at once. Arvin didn't one day decide to go silent. It began with small sacrifices, biting his tongue to keep the peace, hiding his doubts so he wouldn't worry his children, nodding along when he disagreed because he didn't want to be difficult. These small things stacked like stones until a wall was built between him and everyone he loved. Jung believed that we all wear masks, what he called the persona, a version of ourselves shaped by society's expectations. Arvin's mask was strength. He wore it so convincingly that even he began to believe it. He became the man who didn't cry, didn't complain, didn't need comfort. But here's the tragedy of the persona. The longer you wear it, the more others forget there's a person beneath it. Arvin's family never asked about his fears, because they didn't know he had any. They never asked about his dreams, because he never shared them. They saw the mask, not the man. It wasn't just emotional, it was spiritual. The soul has a voice, and when you ignore it for long enough, it starts to whisper in your sleep, scream in your silence, ache in your body. Arvin began to feel a strange emptiness, even during happy moments. A birthday party would pass, and he'd be smiling, nodding, but the joy never touched him. He realized, slowly and painfully, that being present and being seen are not the same thing. One night, Arvin watched his family laughing around the dinner table. His grandson told a joke. His daughter rolled her eyes. His son poured another cup of tea. And Arvin just sat there, smiling the way they expected him to. But inside, he thought, none of them know who I am. Not really. It wasn't their fault. It was his, because he had never shown them. This is where the mystery deepens. Most people think loneliness means you're unloved, but Jung's insight reveals something more haunting. You can be deeply loved and still completely unknown. And in some ways, that's worse, because it means the people who care for you are loving the version of you that you perform, not the soul you've buried. Jung warned that when the self is split, when the inner truth is hidden behind a role, suffering will follow. And for Arvin, the suffering wasn't loud. It was silent, slow, and suffocating. A subtle kind of despair that made him feel like a background character in his own life. Let me ask you something difficult. Has anyone ever said, "We love you," and you wanted to reply, "But you don't know me"? Have you ever felt invisible in a room full of people who would rush to help you, but wouldn't recognize your inner voice if it screamed? Arvin's story is not rare. It's just rarely spoken aloud, because the person who feels invisible in their own house often keeps that pain hidden, and the longer they hide it, the more they convince themselves that maybe this is just what aging feels like. But it's not. This is not aging, this is abandonment of the self. A self that has waited for decades to be seen, to be heard, to be known, not as a role, but as a human being. So if you've ever sat at your own dinner table and felt like a guest, If you've ever watched your family and wondered when the connection faded, if you've ever thought, they love me, but they don't really know me, you are not alone. You're just wearing a mask that's grown too heavy. And here's the truth that hurts, but also heals. The people in your house didn't stop seeing you. They never got the chance to. This is how loneliness begins. Not in empty rooms, but in crowded ones where you feel unseen. He looked like the kind of man who had it all figured out. Stoic, dependable, unshakable. But sometimes the strongest-looking tree is hollow inside, and it only takes a quiet wind to expose the cracks. Arven had spent decades becoming what his family needed. A reliable father, a calm presence, the kind of man who never caused problems, never made demands, and never asked for help. But underneath that calm exterior was a truth he buried so deeply, he almost forgot it was there. He was exhausted from pretending. In Jungian psychology, this performance is known as the persona, the mask we wear to function in society. Arven's mask was crafted early in life. As a boy, he was praised for being mature, for not crying, for staying strong when others couldn't. That mask became armor, and that armor became prison. At family dinners, Arven was present, but not truly there. He laughed at jokes, nodded along to stories, passed the dishes, but inside, he felt like a ghost haunting his own house. Everyone saw Dad or Grandpa, but no one saw him. And how could they? He never showed them. Jung wrote, "The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is." The danger isn't just that others mistake your mask for your identity, it's that you begin to forget where the mask ends and the soul begins. One afternoon, something strange happened at his grandson's birthday. A moment so small no one else noticed, but for Arven, it cracked something open. His grandson asked each adult in the room to share what made them scared as a child. Laughter erupted, stories flowed, but when it came to Arven, he froze. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because he couldn't let himself speak it. His throat locked, his mind raced, and after a tense silence, he gave a dry smile and said, "I can't really remember." It was a lie. He remembered the dark room, the yelling, the fear of never being good enough. But those memories belonged to a part of him no one had ever met, not even his own children. Jung believed that what we hide in the persona gets pushed into the shadow, the unconscious parts of ourselves we repress. Arven's shadow was full of unspoken griefs, childhood wounds, questions about life he never dared ask. And like all shadows, it grew stronger the longer it was ignored. The irony? His family loved him. But they loved the version of him he presented. And as Jung warned, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. Arven avoided it for 50 years. Let me tell you a story, one that echoes Arven's and maybe yours. There was a man named Nadim, a respected school principal. Everyone described him the same way, calm, wise, composed. He wore his role like a tailored suit, but one day, a student he adored broke down in tears during a counseling session, sharing how alone he felt, and Nadim, moved by something he couldn't explain, started crying too, uncontrollably. No one had seen him cry in 20 years. Later, he confessed that he wasn't weeping for the boy, he was weeping for himself, because the boy had said what he never could. His role had silenced his soul, his persona had erased his pain. And once the mask cracked, the flood came through. This is the betrayal of the persona. It promises protection, but over time it becomes a wall between you and those you love. Arven was respected, but not known, admired, but not understood, present, but emotionally invisible. And here's the cruel irony. He had built that invisibility with his own hands, brick by brick, every time he said, "I'm fine," when he wasn't. Every time he smiled when he was aching. Every time he listened but never shared. Because when the mask fits too well, even you forget it's a mask, And when you forget, the people around you never even think to ask what's underneath. A mask that once helped you survive can later become the reason no one truly knows you. Most people think silence in old age means peace, but sometimes it's the sound of something waking up inside. Not peace, not contentment, but a voice that's been buried for decades, finally rising. Carl Jung called this voice the shadow, the part of ourselves we hide from others, and often from ourselves. And as we grow older, it no longer stays quiet. Arvin didn't expect it. He had spent most of his life distracted with work, raising children, saving for retirement, fixing the house, following the script of what a good man should do. But the moment the noise outside slowed down, the noise inside got louder. It began with dreams. One night he found himself standing in front of his childhood home, the grass overgrown, the porch light flickering. He walked up the steps, hand outstretched, but the door wouldn't open. He tried again. Nothing. It wasn't just a dream. In Jungian psychology, the house often represents the self, and a locked door means there's a part of your inner life that you've never dared to enter. Arvin had spent his whole life outside that door, thinking he was safe. But now, his unconscious wanted in. The shadow was knocking. The next morning, he woke up irritable. A simple question from his wife. "Did you take your pills?" Made him snap. He didn't know why. Another day, his grandson spilled a glass of water, and Arvin exploded in frustration, though he immediately felt ashamed. These weren't just mood swings. They were messages. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Arvin wasn't angry at his family. He was angry at the years he lost, pretending he didn't need anything. At church, Arvin used to smile politely, shake hands, and keep quiet. But now, even silence irritated him. It wasn't the sermons or the people. It was the weight of pretending. He started to notice how often he changed the subject when someone asked about his childhood, how quickly he turned questions back on others, how deeply uncomfortable he felt when anyone tried to get close. His body aged, but the emotions he buried as a boy, the fears, the longings, the grief, were still alive inside, untouched. And now they were rising like water, pressing against a dam. Jung warned that repressing parts of ourselves doesn't make them disappear. It just buries them deeper, where they grow more powerful. And sooner or later, what you've ignored returns. Not to punish you, but to be acknowledged, to be integrated. Arvin didn't need therapy to know something was shifting. He felt it in the sudden sadness that came over him while washing dishes, in the tears that rose without warning during a quiet walk, in the memory of his father's cold silence, which now echoed through his own voice. This pattern is not unique. Think of a retired teacher named Yusuf, respected, disciplined, admired by generations. But once he retired, his routine vanished, and with it, the mask he wore for 40 years. Suddenly, he couldn't sleep. He began lashing out at neighbors. He wept during a TV commercial. Everyone said he must be losing it. But he wasn't. He was remembering it. Remembering the parts of himself he had locked away to be the perfect teacher, husband, and father. And now those parts wanted to be heard before it was too late. There's a haunting irony in aging. We fear becoming invisible to others, yet many of us have been invisible to ourselves for most of our lives. Arvin wasn't just growing older, he was becoming aware that beneath the calm father and patient husband was a man who never spoke his truth. And now, in the stillness of old age, that man was finally stirring. Growing older doesn't make you lonely. Hiding your inner world does. Sometimes, the most invisible people are the ones who never caused a single ripple. They never complained, never raised their voice, never made a scene. And that's exactly how they disappear. At Arvin's old workplace, there was a man named Ralph. Soft-spoken, neatly dressed, always on time. He was the kind of man you describe as pleasant, maybe even admirable. He never missed a deadline, never got into drama, never burdened anyone with his emotions. In fact, he was famous for one line: "No worries, I'm okay." Everyone believed him because it was easier to believe the mask than to ask what might be underneath. But masks, as Jung warned, are never the whole truth. They are tools of adaptation, not revelations of the soul. Then, one Monday morning, Ralph didn't show up. Rumors started swirling. By noon it was confirmed. His wife had left him over the weekend. Just packed up and walked out. People were stunned. They looked fine, some said. He never talked about any problems, others added. But that was the very heart of it. Ralph had been in crisis for years, only nobody saw it. Not because they didn't care, but because he never gave them anything to see. In Jungian psychology, this is the danger of an overdeveloped persona. The persona is the version of ourselves we present to the world, shaped by social roles and expectations. But when the persona becomes our entire identity, we lose access to the deeper self. The persona, Jung wrote, is a system of behavior which is in some respects quite artificial. What Ralph hid was not just pain, it was the shadow. The shadow, in Jung's terms, is everything we refuse to show: our fears, our sadness, our needs, our disappointments. And the longer you hide the shadow, the stronger it becomes. Ralph had learned early in life that men don't cry, don't burden, don't confess weakness. So he buried his real self beneath layers of "I'm okay." But buried things don't die, they ferment. His wife didn't leave because of a single argument. She left because she'd spent 20 years living beside a man whose soul never took off its coat. She said to him in a note left behind, "I didn't fall out of love with you. I just never truly met you." That line haunted the office. It made people reevaluate their own masks. The IT manager, who always joked but never talked about his divorce. The HR assistant, who was always cheerful, yet cried alone in her car. We all carry shadows, but only some of us dare to let them speak. And when life pressure mounts, death, divorce, failure, aging, that mask starts to crack. It's not the event that destroys us. It's the weight of unspoken truths finally bursting through. Ralph didn't explode. He collapsed, quietly, like a building whose foundation had been rotting for years. Jung said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. Ralph's story isn't rare, it's just rarely talked about. We assume calm equals peace. We assume silence means strength, but silence is often exile. Ralph had been lonely long before his wife left. He had abandoned himself to keep things smooth, and when the mask broke, no one recognized the man underneath, not even Ralph himself. That's the tragedy of emotional hiding. You vanish so slowly that not even you notice until something collapses. And this is why so many elders feel misunderstood. They didn't just grow old, they grew hidden. The world only knows the mask, not the man behind it. And the older you get, the harder it becomes to remember who you were before the performance began. Have you seen your own mask slip under pressure? We often blame others for not understanding us, but what if the real betrayal was our own silence? Arvin's ache didn't come from being unloved, it came from being unknown. That distinction, subtle but fatal, is where loneliness hides in plain sight. He believed that being a good father meant being selfless, sturdy, and stoic. He thought if he asked for nothing, gave everything, and kept his emotions in check, he would be respected, maybe even loved more. But in trying to be what he thought his family needed, he disappeared behind the persona Jung warned about. The mask we wear, not just for others, but eventually even for ourselves. The persona, Jung said, is a system of behavior that is partially dictated by society and partially by the individual's ideal image of themselves. Arvin's ideal image was strength. But strength without vulnerability becomes stone, and stone cannot be hugged, held, or healed. For decades his family saw the mask and assumed it was the man. They interpreted his quiet as peace, his emotional restraint as confidence, his lack of requests as independence. But beneath that mask lived a man who hadn't cried in years, not because he didn't feel, but because he didn't know how to let it show anymore. He had needs, fears, and longings, but never gave them names, and so no one else did either. Let me tell you about Omar, a retired firefighter Arvan used to meet at the park bench every Wednesday. Everyone said Omar was a rock, steady, dependable, always smiling. But after his daughter's wedding, something shifted. He showed up one morning in the same clothes as the day before, his eyes dimmer than usual. When Arvan asked him how the wedding went, Omar laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of joy. "Beautiful," he said. "I don't think she looked at me more than once." For a moment, the mask cracked. He admitted he had spent her whole life providing, fixing, being reliable, but never vulnerable. He never told her about his guilt from a failed rescue, never shared his nightmares, never admitted how scared he was of aging alone. And now she treated him like furniture, always there, but rarely noticed. Jung called this the tragedy of the hardened persona, when the mask becomes so thick, even love can't get through. Omar's daughter loved him, but she didn't know him, and you cannot love someone fully if you've never met their inner world. The irony is that men like Arvan and Omar often pride themselves on not needing attention, not needing help. They wear that pride like armor, but armor doesn't just keep danger out, it keeps connection out. And when the years pass, they find themselves surrounded by people who appreciate them, but don't truly see them. Why would they? They were never shown the map to that deeper terrain. Jung warned of the danger of over-identifying with the role you play. If you confuse your persona with your soul, you become a stranger in your own home. You may sit at the table, smile at birthdays, even give warm advice. But nobody will ask about your dreams, your pain, or your joy, because you taught them not to. You trained the world to see only the surface, and then you wonder why you feel unseen. This is the devastating trick of projection. We think others are ignoring us, when in truth they are responding to the image we gave them. Arvan's family didn't withdraw because they didn't care. They withdrew because every attempt to enter his inner world was gently deflected for decades. And after a while, people stopped knocking on locked doors. So when Arvan began to feel invisible, it wasn't because they failed him. It was because he had vanished behind his role so completely, the real him never made an appearance. And roles, no matter how noble, are just costumes. They don't carry a heartbeat. They don't hold warmth. And when the time comes to be remembered, it won't be your reliability they recall. It will be your humanity, or the absence of it. This is the harsh mirror Jung places before us. If you crave to be seen in your elder years, ask yourself, have you ever truly shown yourself? And here lies the heartbreaking truth. You cannot blame people for not seeing the person you never revealed. If you've never shown your true self, your family can only love the mask you gave them. Sometimes the soul doesn't scream, it whispers. And if you're still enough, a single whisper can shatter a lifetime of silence. It was an ordinary Sunday afternoon, the kind filled with the hum of laughter, clinking teacups, and the soft shuffle of feet across carpet. Arvan sat at the edge of the living room couch during a family gathering, half listening to his grandchildren sprawled on the floor, laughing, teasing, sharing secrets. They were animated, expressive, unfiltered in a way he had never been allowed to be at their age. One boy, barely 16, confessed aloud to feeling unsure of his future. His voice trembled slightly, but he didn't flinch. Instead, the others nodded, one placing a hand on his shoulder, another offering a story of their own confusion. It wasn't mockery, it wasn't shame, it was welcome. And Arvin felt it, that ache that starts not in the heart but in the ribs, in the breath, in the place where buried words go to rot. He had lived his life under a different code. Be strong, be silent, be the stable one. Vulnerability had been seen as a weakness. Emotions were for closing the door, turning your back and dealing with privately, if at all. And yet here they were, his bloodline, speaking the language of emotional fluency he had never been taught. He felt not resentment, but a peculiar kind of grief. Grief for a self that never got to be that free. In that moment, Carl Jung's words echoed like thunder in a cathedral. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. Arvin had spent his life being a man of few words, calm, dependable, emotionally distant, not out of cruelty, but because no one ever taught him how to speak the language of his own soul. He'd worn the persona of the provider, and society had rewarded him for it. But the cost was high. Connection had slipped through his fingers while he was busy holding up everyone else. As he watched the room through watery eyes, he noticed something else, his daughter looking at him with gentle concern. "Dad, you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but curious, genuine. He felt his reflex rise like a shield. Say yes. Say you're fine. Smile. Nod. But he paused. For the first time in decades, he didn't lie. Not with his words, but with his silence. He nodded slowly, not to dismiss, but to acknowledge the storm brewing behind his ribs. This moment, so small, held power, because it shattered the illusion that his loneliness was about his age. It wasn't. It wasn't about his children ignoring him or the world moving too fast. It was about the persona he had spent his entire life perfecting, one that had become a prison. Jung's concept of the shadow came rushing back. All those suppressed desires, regrets, and truths he'd locked away to be the man he was supposed to be were now pacing in his chest like caged lions. Years ago, he might have judged someone like his grandson for crying openly. But now, he envied it. There was something divine in that unfiltered expression, a divine he had spent a lifetime exiling. The family he loved was not distant. They were simply fluent in a language he had never dared to speak. And that, ironically, was the language he needed most. Arvin's loneliness wasn't caused by their absence. It was born from his own. He had left himself behind somewhere between duty and politeness, between cultural conditioning and personal fear. And now, in the quiet warmth of a family that would have welcomed him sooner had he let them, he realized something heartbreaking. He had been surrounded by love, but never known how to receive it. And here's the twist. The moment he became aware of this, truly aware, his mask didn't fall off. It cracked, just enough for the first truth to leak out. That night he sat in bed, not feeling broken, but awakened. The ache in his chest wasn't emptiness. It was the sound of a soul stretching for the first time in decades. He wasn't ready to tell his whole story yet, but he was no longer willing to keep it buried. Loneliness is the pain of a self that has never been introduced to the world. You don't always hear the shadow speak. Sometimes it shows up as a slammed door, a cold silence, or an irritation that seems to come from nowhere. That's the trick of the unconscious. It doesn't whisper in words, it roars in reactions. Carl Jung warned us that whatever you do not bring into consciousness will appear in your life as fate. And that fate, for Arvin, came not as some grand event, but in the quiet unraveling of his emotional world. He started getting angry at little things. A plate left slightly out of place, a grandchild asking the same question twice, the volume of a laugh that was just a little too loud. None of these should have mattered. But they did, and Arvin didn't know why. It wasn't rage he was feeling, it was accumulation. Every unspoken sentence, every suppressed disappointment, every tear swallowed in the name of strength. They hadn't vanished, they had matured underground, and now They were coming back, not as memories but as behaviors. He couldn't explain the weight in his chest or why conversations drained him faster than labor ever did. Jungian psychology explains this as the shadow surfacing, the parts of the self we pushed away for the sake of social roles, now clawing to be acknowledged. Let me give you a story that might sound familiar. A friend of mine, Idris, was the kind of man you'd call balanced, calm, respectful, always composed. He led a team of younger employees who admired him, but also found him a bit distant. One day, a junior teammate accidentally deleted a shared folder. The mistake was fixable, but Idris exploded. Red-faced, trembling, voice cracking, it was a fury no one had ever seen. People were stunned. "Where did that come from?" they asked. Later, Idris confessed that he wasn't really angry about the folder. He was angry that for 10 years, no one had acknowledged how hard he worked behind the scenes. Angry that he had never asked for credit and no one had offered it. Angry that every time he was overwhelmed, he had said, "It's fine," when it wasn't. His breakdown wasn't about that moment. It was the return of everything he buried for a decade. That's how the shadow works. It waits. Then it speaks through the cracks in our routines, through our tone, our tension, our distance. Arven's family began walking on eggshells around him, thinking he was just becoming moody with age. But it wasn't age. It was the past asking to be felt. And this is where dramatic irony unfolds. The very family he longed to connect with was now pulling away, not out of malice, but confusion. They didn't know what he was really fighting, because he didn't know either. Jung teaches that the shadow isn't evil. It's ignored. It's not the villain of our psyche. It's the orphan, the wounded part that wasn't allowed at the dinner table, so it learned to scream from the attic. Arven began to see that every sharp word was a plea. Every cold silence was grief in disguise. The more he pushed his truth down, the more it pulled others away. He had always believed emotional control meant strength, but he was learning, too late perhaps, that emotional honesty was the real strength. He started observing his own reactions. When his granddaughter asked, "Why are you always tired, Grandpa?" he felt like snapping, but he paused. What if her question wasn't disrespect, but an invitation, an opportunity to be known, not managed? That night he wrote something in his journal for the first time in years. "Maybe I've been angry at myself for being silent too long. This is the quiet tragedy of emotional suppression. It doesn't stay buried. It metastasizes into behavior, into withdrawal, into sarcasm, into unexplained fatigue, into the kind of tension that no massage can relieve." Arven began to see that he wasn't being punished by the shadow. He was being invited to finally sit with the part of himself he had ignored the longest. Because in the end, as Jung so powerfully said, your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. And Arven was waking up. Your shadow doesn't punish you. It tries to reconnect you with who you abandoned. Some men become experts at providing everything, except themselves. That was Farid. On paper, he was what most would call a success. A disciplined boss, a reliable provider, the kind of man whose calendar was always full, whose decisions were respected, whose house was never short on food, bills paid, birthdays remembered. But behind all that structure was a silence so vast it echoed through the very home he built. Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Farid never dared try. To the outside world, Farid was a fortress, unshakable, composed. But inside, he was a stranger to himself. He wore the persona of the good man, the classic archetype of the stoic provider. Jung identified personas as necessary adaptations, but warned, if mistaken for identity, they can suffocate the soul. Farid mistook performance for presence, and in doing so, he lived beside his family, not with them. The fracture didn't begin with shouting or betrayal. It began in subtle, invisible ways. His daughter stopped telling him about her fears because he wouldn't get it. His son stopped asking for advice because he's too busy. His wife, once warm and affectionate, became quiet. Farid chalked it up to stress, to their immaturity, to the natural distance that comes with age. He didn't realize he had become emotionally unreachable, a shadow figure in his own family portrait. Let me tell you about the night that should have broken the illusion, but didn't. It was his wedding anniversary. A modest dinner was planned, nothing grand, just close family. His wife had prepared his favorite dish, laid out the table, even lit a candle, an attempt to soften the weight that had grown between them. When Farid walked in, he nodded, said, "Thanks," and sat down to check his phone. No compliment, no eye contact, no warmth. Not because he was cruel, but because he no longer knew how to be emotionally present. That night, his wife looked at him like she was watching someone slowly disappear. Because she was. Farid believed that love was in labor. If he worked hard, provided, stayed loyal, he was doing his part. But here's the truth Carl Jung reveals. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. Farid hid behind productivity because he was terrified of vulnerability. He didn't know how to say, "I'm scared," or "I feel lost," or even, "I miss being close to you." So he said nothing, and his silence spoke louder than any fight ever could. The collapse came gradually. His wife didn't leave in rage, she left in resignation. His children didn't rebel. They drifted. One by one, the emotional bridges burned, not with fire, but with neglect. Farid told himself they were ungrateful, that they didn't appreciate all he did. But the painful irony, they never saw what he felt because he never showed it. His persona became a wall. His family had been trying to connect with a man who wasn't home, internally. Jung warned of this fate. When the persona dominates, the shadow, the buried fears, longings, truths, swells beneath. If not integrated, it erodes you from within. Farid's real self had been whispering for years, aching to be expressed. But silence has a cost. You can live your whole life believing you're being strong, only to realize too late that strength without openness creates isolation, not intimacy. Farid's story is not rare. It is a mirror for millions. People confuse responsibility with connection, but you can feed a family and still starve them emotionally. You can share a roof and still be absent. You can give your time and still withhold your soul. You can give people everything except the one thing they truly need, the real you. They say the saddest loneliness is not when no one is around, it's when everyone is. Picture a dinner table filled with laughter, stories, clinking glasses. And yet one person sits quietly, smiling politely, nodding at the right moments. But inside, they are vanishing. This was Arven's reality, not because his family abandoned him, but because long ago he abandoned himself. According to Carl Jung, the greatest tragedy is not being alone, it's living in exile from your true self. Arven didn't start his life that way. In his youth, he dreamed wildly. He had fears, questions, deep wells of emotion. But somewhere along the path, through responsibilities, expectations, and unspoken cultural rules, he began to trade pieces of himself for approval, for peace, for survival. He became who the world needed him to be, and stopped being who he really was. Jung called this the betrayal of the self through the over-identification with the persona, the mask we wear to fit into the social world, and Arven wore his mask well. The strong father, the dependable husband, the silent listener, but masks don't breathe. And over time, neither did he. While his family grew, he shrank, not in stature, but in soul. Each time he said, "I'm fine," when he wasn't, a part of him faded. Each time he buried his needs to avoid conflict, the soil inside thickened. He was surrounded by people, yet untouched, loved but not known. And in Jungian terms, this is the soul's silent scream, when the self is locked in a cage of duty, unable to speak. Let me tell you about a man named Halim. He was a respected teacher, admired by students, praised by peers. At every school event, he played the mentor role perfectly. But one night he confessed to a friend, "I don't think anyone really knows me. Not even his wife, not even himself." He had become so skilled at being the calm one that even in moments of personal loss, he couldn't cry. His emotions had no exit, no witness. And what Jung said echoed through his life like a bell. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. Halim wasn't unloved, he was unexpressed. The people in his life loved his character, not his truth, his presence, not his presence of mind. This is what Jung meant when he said loneliness is not cured by proximity. It is healed only by authenticity. Arven's wife never knew his favorite poem. His children never saw him cry. His grandchildren had never heard a story about his youth that wasn't a lesson. And when he looked around the room, he wondered why no one came closer. But the truth was brutal. No one knew there was a door to knock on, because Arven never opened it. There's a dramatic irony here, one that Jung would call archetypal. The archetype of the wise elder is supposed to be a source of emotional insight, yet Arven, like many aging men, had never been taught to offer his emotional truth as wisdom. Instead, he offered silence wrapped in smiles. And so, while others sat at the table of connection, he stood outside, unknowingly, holding the key to the room he'd locked himself out of. Jung taught that the soul does not stay silent forever. As people age, the voice of the self, the true self, begins to rise like a forgotten song. And it doesn't whisper, it howls. That's why so many feel restless in old age. Not because the world has abandoned them, but because the self they neglected begins to haunt them. Until you make the unconscious conscious, Jung warned, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Arven once believed his loneliness was fate, the result of aging or modern life, or his children's distractions. But the real reason was buried much closer, within him. The man he once was had never been fully met, not even by his own family. And now, decades later, he sat in the house he built, feeling like a visitor. His name was known, but his soul was a stranger. Here is where Jung's teaching becomes brutally clear. People feel lonely in a room full of family because they abandoned their inner self long before anyone else did. When you replace authenticity with duty, when you replace emotion with silence, when you replace honesty with politeness, you slowly disappear. Jung believed that the soul demands to be seen, and the older you get, the louder that demand becomes. Arven wasn't lonely because nobody cared. He was lonely because he had spent decades pushing away the parts of him that could have formed true connection. And when you abandon your inner world, your outer world becomes a desert, even with people sitting right beside you. The first truth Jung wants you to understand is this: nobody can see you if you refuse to step into the light. And the second truth is even harder. You must stop blaming others for not recognizing the person you never introduced to them. Only when the real self returns can loneliness begin to fade. Loneliness is not a lack of people, it is a lack of self. Some people die slowly while sitting in a room full of people who love them, not because those people don't care, but because the person never showed them who needed to be loved. This is the silent tragedy that Carl Jung spent his life trying to explain. It's not abandonment by others that creates the deepest wounds. It's the abandonment of the inner voice, the refusal to express your real emotions, real fears, real hopes, that slowly severs the soul from connection. Arvin realized this far too late. For decades, he told himself the same quiet lies many of us do. It's not important. They wouldn't understand. This isn't the right time. But the years pass anyway. And what goes unsaid begins to rot, not in the body, but in the space between people. Jung warned, nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment and especially on their children than the unlived life of the parent. The unlived life becomes a ghost in the home, shaping behavior, moods, even the silence at dinner tables, all without being named. Arvin had lived that way, not absent, but emotionally unexpressed, not cruel, but unknowable. His family didn't turn cold, they turned cautious. His children learned to protect him from his own silence. His grandchildren didn't open up to him, not out of rejection, but because they never saw a door. Let me tell you a story, not of Arvin this time, but of a friend named Idris. Idris was a war veteran turned high school principal, respected by everyone in the community. He was disciplined, articulate, firm, but behind the surface was a man who hadn't cried in 30 years. When his wife passed, he gave a beautiful eulogy, not a single tear. People called him strong, but a week later, his daughter found him tearing pages from his old journals in the garage, whispering things to himself like, "What's the point of all this if no one ever knew me?" You see, Idris had spent his whole life playing a role, the role of the hero. But roles don't get mourned. Real people do. And when you never let others see the real you, your pain becomes invisible even to those who love you most. Here's the cruel irony. The longer you stay emotionally silent, the more polite your relationships become. Not deep, polite. People stop asking questions. They stop sharing their own truth around you, not because they don't care, but because you trained them that emotions are off limits in your presence. This is the moment Arvin reached. He had built a quiet, steady home, but in doing so, he also trained his family to tiptoe around his heart, and one day, when he finally craved connection, he reached for a door and found it locked. Not by them, by him. Jung's second reveal is this. Loneliness is not a sign that you lack relationships. It is a sign that your real self has not entered them. People say they feel invisible, but often they haven't spoken their real name out loud in years. Arvin didn't need more visitors. He didn't need more dinners or phone calls. He needed permission from himself to be known, to stop saying "I'm fine" when he wasn't, to stop being the rock and start being the river. Because connection doesn't come from being strong, it comes from being real. And here's the hardest truth. Silence teaches others how to treat you. If you never speak, they learn not to listen. If you never ask, they learn not to offer. If you never share, they learn to withhold. This is not cruelty, it is human adaptation. And so Arvin, like so many, stood in a life he helped build, and couldn't feel a single part of it. The final revelation is brutal, but freeing. You're not missing love, you're missing your own voice inside your relationships. Some silences are so old, they creak when they're broken. Arvin had lived most of his life behind a carefully constructed wall, not of stone, but of smiles, duties, and polite nods. He had mastered the art of being present without being known, of showing up without truly showing himself. But Jung warned that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And that terror had kept Arvin quiet for decades, until one night, in a moment that didn't look special on the surface, just a father and daughter sharing tea, something shifted. The television murmured in the background, casting flickers of color on the walls, but Arvin didn't hear it. He was listening to something deeper, the trembling of his soul, asking for release. He looked at his daughter, and the words came out like an earthquake under soft soil. "I don't think anyone truly knows me." At first, she said nothing. just stared, not with judgment, but with a stunned tenderness. Because in that sentence, the mask cracked. In Jungian terms, Arvin had taken the first step toward individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating the shadow, the suppressed self, into the conscious mind. His persona, the role of the strong, silent father, had served him for years. But now it was peeling away, revealing a man full of unsaid fears, unread pages, and unlived emotions. He began to speak, slowly, but with the aching honesty of someone who had waited too long. He spoke of his boyhood, of a father who taught him that emotion was weakness, of nights he cried quietly into his pillow after being scolded for being too soft. He spoke of marriage, not with bitterness, but with regret, of how he always wanted to be more emotionally open, but didn't know how. He confessed the paralyzing fear of not being enough, and the heavier fear of being too much. His voice cracked when he admitted he often pretended to be busy just to avoid emotional intimacy he didn't know how to receive. And his daughter, eyes wet with tears, realized she was hearing her father for the first time. This is the paradox Carl Jung understood so well, that what we repress in youth returns with a vengeance in age, but also with a chance for healing. Jung believed that the unconscious does not forget. It waits. And when Arvin finally spoke, it wasn't just his voice that filled the room. It was decades of silence, grief, hope, and hunger for connection, all rising together like a tide breaking a dam. A story comes to mind, a man named Navid, a respected elder in his community. To everyone else, he was a rock, composed, generous, always calm. But after a mild heart attack, something broke open. In the hospital, he began sharing things he had never said aloud, his fear of death, his regret for never telling his brother he loved him, his silent envy of those who laughed easily. His children, visiting one by one, were shocked, not by the vulnerability, but by the realization that they'd lived beside a stranger. In his final months, Navid formed deeper bonds than he had in decades, not because people changed, but because he finally removed the armor. This is the power of speaking from the soul. It rewrites relationships. Arvin's daughter didn't love him more after that night. She finally knew who she loved. The shadows he carried for so long weren't monsters. They were the parts of him that had waited patiently to be accepted. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And in that moment, Arvin wasn't confessing weakness, he was claiming wholeness. The beauty of this moment is that it didn't come with fireworks or grand declarations. It came with tea, a couch, a sentence. And yet it changed everything. Sometimes one honest sentence can rebuild a bridge that was broken for 40 years. What if the deepest loneliness in your life isn't caused by other people, but by the version of you they've never met? Carl Jung believed that the journey of a human life is not just about survival, success, or social roles. It's about individuation, the process of becoming your full, authentic self. Not the mask you wear at work, not the role you play in your family, but the real, complex soul behind all of it. For Arvin, this revelation came slowly, like a sunrise breaking through fog. He had spent decades behind his persona, the dependable one, the strong father, the steady grandfather. It was a role he performed so flawlessly that not even he could tell where the mask ended and the man began. But the mask was never the destination. Jung warned that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And Arvin was just beginning that journey, in his 70s. At first, it was small. He stopped pretending that he didn't care when his son forgot to call. He allowed himself to feel disappointment. Then came something more powerful. He began to speak, not from the surface, but from the depth of his being. He told his daughter about how he feared becoming irrelevant. He admitted to his grandson that he didn't have all the answers. He confessed to his wife long gone through a quiet journal entry that he had always been afraid of not being enough. And something remarkable happened. People didn't recoil, they didn't turn away, they leaned in. This is the paradox Jung speaks of. When you finally become vulnerable, you become magnetic. Arvin's grandchildren, once distant and unsure around him, began to ask about his childhood. His son hugged him longer than usual. His daughter, who once kept conversations short and practical, began calling just to talk. What changed? Not them. Him. You see, individuation is not selfish. It's sacred, because only when you reclaim the lost pieces of yourself can others finally find a way to love the whole of you. Arvin's real self, his soul, his shadow, his longings, had been waiting for decades beneath the surface. And once he allowed those parts to rise, the fog of loneliness began to clear. But the path of individuation is not without pain. There is grief in realizing how long you've been absent from your own life. There's sorrow in recognizing the years spent smiling through suppression, laughing through longing. Yet Jung teaches us that these emotions are not signs of failure. They are signs of awakening. Arvin wept not just for what he lost, but for what he finally found. A voice that was his, not inherited. A self that was whole, not performed. To make this even clearer, let's look at another story. A man named Idris, a well-respected teacher known for his wisdom and calm demeanor. For 30 years, students adored him. Colleagues relied on him, but inside, he felt hollow. One day, during a guest lecture, a student asked him what made him happiest in life. Idris paused. The room fell quiet. He realized, with a shock that chilled him to the bone, he had no answer. He had spent his life performing the archetype of the wise elder, but never took time to discover what truly brought him joy. That night, he broke down. And in that breakdown, he began writing again. Poetry, music, things he loved in his youth, but buried beneath responsibility. The persona had served him well, but now it was time to meet the man who lived beneath it. Jung once said, "Man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious." In other words, you cannot stay asleep to who you are and expect to feel known. Arvin's integration of his shadow, his hidden pain, unspoken truths, suppressed desires, wasn't just healing. It was liberating. And the more he accepted his inner complexity, the less he depended on others to validate his worth. This is the soul's quiet revolution. When you no longer demand the world to love your mask, it finally begins to love your truth. He didn't become perfect. He didn't suddenly become loud or charismatic. He just became real. And reality has a strange power. It creates bridges where walls once stood. He didn't need to prove himself to his family anymore. He only needed to reveal himself. And now, a final reflection. If you've ever felt alone in a room full of people who love you, ask yourself, have they ever met the real you? Or only the version you thought they could handle? The moment you become yourself, the world finally has someone real to love. You can sit at the head of the table and still feel like a ghost. It's a strange kind of silence, the one that comes not from others ignoring you, but from you never having shown them who you really are. Arvin had spent over 60 years mastering the art of invisibility. Not the type where people don't look at you, but the deeper kind, where people see your function, not your essence. They see the father, the husband, the provider. They see the one who pays bills, fixes broken things, gives advice when asked. But they don't see the boy who once dreamed of becoming a painter. They don't see the man who once stood in the rain, heartbroken after losing a friend he never dared to mourn publicly. They don't know the fears that have haunted him since his own father told him, "Real men don't cry." Carl Jung believed that every person develops a persona, a mask tailored to meet the demands of society. But the problem begins when the mask becomes mistaken for the man. Jung wrote, "The persona is a system of behavior by which one attempts to adapt to society, but it is only a mask of the collective psyche. That mask, once useful, becomes prison bars in old age. You begin to wonder, who am I when no one's watching? What parts of me have I buried so deeply that even I don't recognize them anymore?" Arvin's turning point came not in a dramatic explosion, but in the soft erosion of time. One morning, he stood before the bathroom mirror, toothbrush in hand, and didn't recognize his own eyes. He had memorized the routine. Wake up, eat, smile, numb. Repeat. But something inside him had started knocking, quietly at first, then louder. A question he couldn't silence. Have I ever really been known? This is the hidden cost of the unexamined persona. It creates relationships that are functional but not intimate. Warm but not soul-connected. Your family thinks they know you, but what they know is the version you've permitted, the edited script of you that left out the raw pages. Arvin had never told his children about his panic attacks in his 20s or the guilt he carried for not attending his brother's funeral. He never shared the fear that he wasn't a good enough father, or that sometimes he lay awake feeling like a stranger in his own home. And yet, he expected his family to just know. This is where Jung's concept of projection comes in. When we disown parts of ourselves, we project the responsibility of understanding onto others. Arvin projected onto his family the role of mind readers. He thought, if they really loved me, they'd ask, what's wrong? But they had learned from decades of silence that emotions were unwelcome territory. His absence from emotional spaces had taught them not to look there. To understand this tragedy better, let's step outside Arvin's story for a moment. Imagine a woman named Eliza, a retired school teacher who was beloved by her students for 40 years. Every morning she'd show up early. Every evening she stayed late. She never missed a birthday, always gave gentle encouragement, and was known for her calm presence. But when she retired, she realized something terrifying. No one knew her, not her neighbors, not even her sister. She had been useful, not known. She broke down one afternoon when a former student asked, "So what do you do now?" And she replied, "I'm trying to remember who I am without being needed." That's the ache Arvin was beginning to feel. He wasn't unloved, he was unknown, and he had made it that way. Jung taught that loneliness in old age is not the absence of relationships. It is the presence of relationships where your real self never arrived. The soul doesn't get quieter as you age. It gets louder, more impatient, more desperate to be seen. So what do? You return, not to who you were in childhood, but to the voice you silenced in order to fit in. You speak honestly, not loudly. You say, "This hurt me. I feared this. I miss that." You reclaim your soul by reintroducing it. It starts with one honest conversation, one moment where you don't default to "I'm fine," where you don't wear the strong mask, where you risk being real. When Arvin did this, he didn't become dramatic or theatrical. He just stopped pretending. He began telling his grandchildren stories from his past, not just about accomplishments, but regrets. He told his daughter he wished he had held her more when she was little. He admitted that sometimes he had no idea how to be a good man. He just did what he thought would hurt the least. And slowly, something miraculous happened. They leaned in, not because he was wise, but because he was real. Here's the truth Jung leaves us with. Individuation, the process of becoming your full self, is not just for the young. In fact, for many, it begins only in old age, only after you've fulfilled your roles and realized they didn't fulfill you. Loneliness is not a sentence, it's a signal, a quiet call from your buried self saying, "Let me out before it's too late." And maybe the most painful irony is this. Your family has been waiting to meet you. but they can't meet a version of you that never showed up. Your true family begins the moment your true self finally comes home.